Head over to patreon.com/MWilliamPhelps and sign up for my free content page, where I'll be interacting with you, doing live streams, posting exclusive content, sending out newsletters, and dropping a major limited series podcast exclusively for Patreon members later this year. That's patreon.com/MWilliamPhelps. patreon.com/MWilliamPhelps. We've all been there. You push the button, look up at the numbers, and wait for the elevator. The door dings. You get ready to step in. But consider this. Just as you are ready to cross the threshold, a dude, sweaty and sketchy looking, steps out in a hurry. A day later, you realize you had actually crossed paths with a sadistic serial killer just after he butchered 2 bodies. And years after that, there you are, sitting, interviewing him, and closing cold cases most everyone thought would never be solved. My name is M. William Phelps. I'm an investigative journalist and the true crime author of close to 50 books. I've dedicated the past 20 years of my life to helping families of the missing and murdered. Join me for the first of a 2-part serial killer special. We're crossing the line. One note about this episode: it contains extremely graphic details some may find disturbing. It's January 1967. It's near 9 p.m. Marianne Della Sala's father is in line at the local ShopRite supermarket where Marianne works. "Do you need a ride home?" he asks his daughter, adding that he will gladly hang around until after her shift ends. "No," Marianne says. "It's a warm night. I'll walk home." They live just about a mile down the road, and Marianne often walks to and from her job. She enjoys the fresh air and time alone with her thoughts. Marianne is 17 years old. She's an honors student senior at Hackensack High School in New Jersey. Well-liked and popular, she has big ambitions after high school. One of 7 children, Marianne has her mind set on becoming a model and has already done some photography work for a local retail store. I'll say this, she has the look to pull off a long career. Straight black hair, parted in the middle, sharp facial features, the figure and an overall look of the all-American girl next door, most sifting through a magazine in the 1960s would expect to see. Mary Tyler Moore, basically. After clocking out of work just after 9 p.m., Mary Ann leaves the store. One of her fellow employees sees Mary Ann walking toward Essex Street, which is the way she would take to go home. But Mary Ann never makes it. After disappearing out of her fellow employee's sight, it is the last time anyone sees her again. And for the next 11 weeks, the search is on for the young girl who seemed to have vanished into thin air. It's now April 1967. 10 miles northwest from Mary Ann's house in Hackensack, a little town called Hawthorne, New Jersey. A man is walking his dog down by the Passaic River, and he spots something in the water floating near the shoreline. He walks up to it. It's a body. In fact, it's Mary Ann Della Sala. She is fully clothed, but has definitely been dead for quite some time. After being pulled from the river, officials first wonder if Mary Ann had fallen in and drowned. An accidental death. A terrible, terrible tragedy. But after an autopsy, The pathologist says he believes Marianne was strangled to death and dumped into the river not long after she went missing. It would take a number of decades to figure out from there, but Mary Ann Della Sala was murdered by a serial killer roaming throughout Bergen County, New Jersey, into New York City, and even perhaps a wider region than that, choosing his victims at random. His name will be familiar to you, Richard Cottingham. And although I would like to go through all of his victims and tell each one of their stories here, because they deserve it, there are just too many. And so I want to instead focus on the mind of this monster, bringing in someone who knows him better than anyone else and has interviewed Cottingham since 2018, speaks to him just about every day still, has written several books about serial killers, and actually had a chance encounter with Cottingham right after Cottingham disposed of 2 bodies. What's interesting, according to my guest, is that Cottingham is an anomaly within the batch of common infamous serial killers most true crimers are familiar with. Because as my guest will explain in more detail a little later, he does not believe Cottingham is a psychopath. That's right. A guy who is admitted to murdering upwards of 100 women is not a psychopath. I should note up front that my guest, Dr. Peter Vronsky, he lives in Canada and has been making documentary films for decades and considers himself an investigative historian. He holds a PhD in criminal justice history and espionage in international relations from the University of Toronto. He is the author of Serial Killers, The Method and Madness of Monsters, which I have on my bookshelf. I think maybe a lot of you do too. He has also written Female Serial Killers, How and Why Women Become Monsters, and Sons of Cain, A History of Serial Killers from the Stone Age to the Present, and most recently, American Serial Killers, The Epidemic Years, 1950 to 2000. So you get the idea here that Vronsky focuses his work on the history of serial killing, not necessarily the mind of the serial killer. He is currently working on a book called American Werewolf, the true story of the Torso Serial Killer Confessions, which is about Cottingham. And he also lectures at Toronto Metropolitan University's History Department.
I don't claim to be an expert on serial killers. I'm not a profiler. I got interested in serial killers because I had 2 random encounters when I worked as a journalist in the 1970s, 80s, 90s. One was with Richard Cottingham, a brief, maybe 12-second encounter on an elevator when he was fleeing the scene of the Torso murders in New York.
This encounter Dr. Vronsky talks about is remarkable, but wouldn't lead to anything with Cottingham until another several decades, when Cottingham, incarcerated then, latches onto Vronsky and begins to confess to additional unsolved murders.
I was trying to check into the hotel, the Travel Inn, very early Sunday morning. No rooms were available yet. This was 1979. New York was a very rough place, and I had never stayed there before. And so I figured I'll take a walk around the hotel before I decide if I'm going to stay here or not. So I go to the elevator banks, and the elevator isn't coming down. It's stuck on the upper floor. And I'm getting annoyed, right? I'm pushing that button. That elevator isn't coming down any faster. So it probably maybe was a minute and a half, but it seemed like forever. So when the elevator comes down, I'm going to give whoever's on that elevator, well, I was going to give them a dirty look, like, how long does it take you to get on an elevator? And so the doors open, and there's this guy, like a dweeby-looking office guy, And we did the kind of thing in the doorway where I went left, he went right, then I went the other way. Then, you're getting up, you're getting on. And then he just went right through me. And the only thing I remembered about him was there was this like a sheen of perspiration on his forehead. He was shining. And he had this weird page boy haircut. He looked like one of those televangelists. Other than that, I couldn't tell you the color of his eyes, whether he was wearing glasses, whether he had a mustache. I don't remember anything about him, other than he bumped me as he was leaving the elevator with something that felt like, and this is something kind of I imposed on my memory, because at that time it was just something that hit me, but I just remember it as being bowling balls in a soft bag.
Photographs of Cottingham near this time made me think, is it me? Or when we look back at serial killers, they tend to fit congenially into the part. It must be a self-fulfilling prophecy partly, that our minds know they are serial killers, so we automatically view them as disgusting and creepy. But Richard Cottingham, a.k.a. the Torso Killer and Times Square Ripper, back when he was first caught, man, does he look like a monster. He has one of those thick, bushy mustaches, greasy and curling around the sides of his mouth, receding hairline, a large head, small, beady, dark eyes, a dimple on his chin, chubby cheeks, a beer gut, and this overall look as if he just rolled out of bed. And dare I say it, and maybe I should whisper this, but he has that look of someone who definitely smells. You all know what I'm talking about. This is the same man Vronsky runs into coming out of that elevator, but having no clue at the time that he just crossed paths with one of the era's most notoriously sadistic serial killers.
He had just come down from setting fire to the torsos in the room upstairs.
Cottingham was born in 1946. He's been convicted of 6 murders, and yet my guest, who is, there can be no doubt, the expert on Cottingham, says Cottingham could have killed upwards of 100 women. That's right, 100. I'm not sure I'd buy into that number, but let's hear Dr. Vronsky out, because he does have a solid argument. Cottingham's thing was mutilation, hence the Torso Killer moniker given to him. On that day, Vronsky ran into Cottingham. Vronsky didn't know it was him, of course, but just after seeing this sweaty man in a hurry walk out of the elevator, Vronsky hits the button.
And so I decided I'm going to go to his floor. Might as well start off at the top floor. So I hit the button. I get off at the 4th floor, and right away I smelled something. It smelled like a little bit like breakfast frying, a little bit like burnt chicken feathers. But I thought that's what the hotel smells like. I didn't see any smoke. I didn't see any flame, nothing. I didn't think it was a fire. And so I took a walk in one direction, but when I came back to pass by the elevators, I began to see like a mist, and there were like little, almost like snowflakes, tiny little black snowflakes swirling around. And so when I went around the corner to that hallway, then I saw the smoke. And there was smoke on the ceiling. There was staff from the hotel, like the housekeepers, banging away on doors and stuff. And I just bolted. I went down the stairs. I knew enough by then, don't get on the elevator, right? This is, a nightmare scenario.
Good thing he got out of the building when he did, because Cottingham had just lit several of his victims on fire on that floor where Vronsky ran into all the smoke. And unbeknownst to Vronsky, he would not only become friends with the same man, but interview him in great depth about his crimes for many years to come. When we return, we'll go inside the mind of one of the country's most prolific and disturbing serial killers before getting into why Vronsky contacted me with an issue he has regarding a case I covered here on Crossing the Line. I have to tell you, when I listen to a true crime podcast, what I am looking for is hosts qualified to talk about what it is they are actually talking about. It's pretty hard to find these days. My friends Alice and Brett from the Prosecutors podcast have the experience and knowledge to drill deep into the cases they cover with sensitivity, factual reporting, engaging storytelling, and the perfect amount of personal chit-chat. So I encourage you to check out The Prosecutors, a top-notch true crime podcast, wherever you get your favorite shows. You won't be disappointed. I'll be right back after a short break. Peter Vronsky did not stick around that hotel on the day Cottingham lit those bodies on fire, and he just happened to run into him inside the elevator as Cottingham was leaving the scene. The following morning, Peter went to pick up some film he had sent out for development. As he is waiting, he sees the morning newspaper on a coffee table.
I get to my destination where I had to pick up film at Duart Film Lab. And so when I'm in the lobby waiting for the film to be delivered back to me, I look in the papers on the coffee table there in the lobby, right? And you know, 2 torsos set on fire, sex workers. I mean, they didn't say sex workers. It was like hookers, right, in the papers at that time. I go, holy shit, that's what I was in. I didn't think of the guy on the elevator. Not at all. The word serial killer didn't exist at that time. We didn't use it. It gets out and first starts being used publicly kind of in the New York Times around 1981 to describe Wayne Williams. So all those concepts of, the guy next door, or maybe your husband, or your teacher, your fellow worker, or some random guy on the elevator, they didn't exist.
Cottingham had actually dismembered those 2 bodies before lighting them on fire. When we talk about sadistic serial killers, Cottingham fits into the profile pretty specifically. One victim who got away later talked about how he had handcuffed her, got on top of her back, put a knife to her throat, began to torture her, and, forgive my frankness, but there is no other way to explain this, Cottingham nearly bit her nipples off. And as he was torturing the young woman, he said things like this: "You are a whore and you have to be punished. You have to take it. The other girls did." The woman was able to get away from him, run out of the hotel room they were in, and scream. Employees inside the hotel heard her screams, called police, and Cottingham was arrested. I mention these graphic details because of what you will hear Dr. Vronsky say about some of his conversations with Cottingham regarding his upbringing. How Cottingham describes his early childhood and being raised. What's odd about this relationship Vronsky begins later with Cottingham is that it was never his intention to sit down with a noted serial killer and interview him. Vronsky doesn't even claim to be a serial killer expert.
I've written about their history. And so if I'm going to claim to be an expert on anything, I am at least an expert on their history. But I'd never met them. I never wanted to. I saw all the YouTube videos of interviews from every serial killer. Interviewers ask the same questions I would ask, and I hear very unsatisfactory answers from them all. So I never and ever, until Cottingham, ever went to visit a serial killer in the prison, and I wasn't interested in doing so.
Earlier in the episode, I talked about Mary Ann de la Salle's story of disappearing one night on her way home and winding up in the Passaic River 10 miles away, strangled to death. That case mystified investigators for many years. They had no clue as to a suspect. They had information that Marianne might have gotten into a vehicle, but other than that, they really had nothing. Then Cottingham began admitting to murders after he is caught torturing and assaulting that woman who got away, and several cold cases are then connected to him.
Mary Ellen de la Salle is one of the last of, although not quite the last, one of the last of the unsolved Bergen County murders in New Jersey. Cottingham lived in Little Ferry and Lodi in Bergen County. He was first arrested there quite at random in May of 1980, and he was linked to 2 murders in Bergen County in 1980. And he went on trial. He was convicted in both, and then he was extradited to New York, where he was tried for 3 more murders, including the double homicide, the torso murders, and the murder of Jean Renier in the Seville Hotel in 1980 as well. So 5 murders total. The trials took place between 1980 to 1984. He's put away, and he drops off the radar. He keeps his mouth shut for the next 30 years. No interviews, no letters, no postcards, no clown paintings, none of that bullshit that all the other serial killers are into. He is completely off the radar to the point that corrections officers by 2009, 2010, don't know who the hell this guy is. He's just an aging old man. Nobody knows him.
All that time passes and Cottingham never says anything. And this is what I find most telling about this guy. That he could keep his mouth shut for that long before stepping forward to make what are some seriously bold claims, including a case I covered here last year on Crossing the Line, which Vronsky and I will get into later. Now, whenever we talk about serial killers and their confessions, what they tell investigators and journalists, we have to approach it all with very skeptical eyes and ears. Because look, psychopaths tend to over-dramatize their roles in everything they do after they are caught. They generally take 2 roads. Either clam up, as Cottingham apparently did, or they begin to enjoy the spotlight and talk openly, like, say, Bundy or Gacy. They enjoy the fame and the limelight. A psychopath, you hear me say this all the time, craves stimulation, whether on the outside or confined to prison. They relish in what is called their grandiose self-worth. And keep in mind, they also lack a realistic view of the long term. Another major trait of the serial killer is their failure to accept responsibility. And we seem to have all of this in Cottingham's profile, especially the latter. After those initial convictions Vronsky mentioned, Cottingham does speak. In fact, he claims that he is innocent of all the charges and that he has been framed. But nobody pays any attention to the guy because, in all honesty, the evidence against him is quite overwhelming. Then, after decades of not hearing all that much out of him, this happens.
2009, a woman, a journalist, Nadia Fizzani from Canada, who resembles to a certain extent one of the torso victims, Didea Gudarzi, who was an Iranian national who Cottingham murdered, reached out to him and convinced him to do an interview. And so in that interview, Cottingham, for the first time, claimed that he killed between 85 and 100 women.
So now we have a serial killer who steps forward and suddenly is interested in taking responsibility. This after years of saying he was framed. He is now willing to admit to more murders than any other serial killer on record at the time. Cottingham literally goes from 0 to 100 victims. I call bullshit on this. Is he playing with us? Is he trying to impress the journalist, who, as Vronsky states, looks an awful lot like one of Cottingham's known victims. Is he looking to make a name for himself at a time when the entire public view of serial killers begins to shift in popular culture, and serial killers are now becoming mainstream fodder for television and books? And Vronsky, in the beginning, before he sat down with Cottingham, seems to support what I am saying.
Of course, that sounded like an impossible number because the earliest murder we had for him was 1977, Mary Ann Carr, and the last one was in 1980 May. So in a 3-year span, come on, forget about it.
As Vronsky digs in, he uncovers a few things that perhaps make what Cottingham is now saying a slight bit more credible.
Unknown to the journalist, unknown to everybody, an investigator with the Bergen County BCPO, the Bergen County Prosecutor's Office, had already been interviewing Cottingham since around 2004, 2005. And in fact, Cottingham had attempted to confess back in 1996 to a number of murders, including the murder of Nancy Vogel in 1967.
Nancy Vogel was murdered in the same year that Marianne Della Sala was also murdered, the victim I spoke of at the top of the episode, which places Cottingham killing women a lot earlier than the years he had been convicted for killing women. After Nancy Vogel, Cottingham admits to killing two more, 17-year-old Mary Pryor and 16-year-old Marie Kelly, both from Bergen County as well, in 1974. He says he abducted the girls near a mall and took them to a motel room where he repeatedly raped each of them before drowning them in the bathtub. He then disposed of their bodies in the woods near Montvale, 25 miles away from where the girls lived in North Bergen. According to that investigator Vronsky mentioned, the chief of detectives for the BCPO, Cottingham was able to provide details of the murders no one else but the killer could have known. So everyone believed him. Both girls were hitchhiking to the Garden State Plaza Mall in Paramus from their homes, on their way to get new swimsuits for a trip to the Jersey Shore. Witnesses later say they see a white man pull over and pick the girls up. That investigator believes that man was Richard Cottingham, whom he had been interviewing himself for about 15 years. These new confessions by Cottingham, which seem to be backed up by evidence that nobody else could have killed the girls, opens up a new span of years, offering the opportunity, at least on paper, for Cottingham to have murdered, as he is now saying, upwards of 100 women. Before this, as Vronsky noted, 3 to 4 years just wasn't enough time to kill that many. But the new confessions changed things remarkably.
And so when you do the math, let's say it's 100 murders between 1967 and 1980, that's maybe one murder every 6 weeks. So suddenly the number wasn't all that crazy, especially in the days of before DNA, before cell phones, before profiling, before we even had the word serial killer, when police had a very simplistic notion, and some of them still do, that, serial killers have the same MO. And they don't. The MO always changes.
Vronsky tells me that Cottingham was a highly territorial serial killer who tended to commit murders within a territory between what are called anchors, which simply means points where a perpetrator feels safe, comfortable, and frequently trolls. He is also familiar with an adjacent territory through which he uses to travel to and from the anchor. Cottingham was no doubt an impulsive serial killer. Opportunistic is maybe another way of describing his most inherent MO. Cottingham did not always murder at the time he was associated with the anchor. Sometimes he would return to it later when he no longer had a connection to it. And that is important, I think, within the reason why he was able to kill as long as he did without being caught. These are some of the things that serial killers think about: proximity to victim, proximity to where they live, proximity to the abduction spot. Okay? Those are very important things for the serial killer. The data, according to Vronsky, is remarkable when you look at anchor-type serial killers. Of 126 non-migratory American serial killers whose cases were put to the test, 89% lived within a circle defined by two body disposal sites farthest from each other. Cottingham is outside that norm, however, because he had multiple primary anchors and secondary anchors interconnecting with each other from his home in Bergen County, New Jersey, his places of employment in Manhattan, his mother-in-law's house in Queens Village, an uncle's house in Massapequa, Long Island, and a second uncle's house on Saddle River Road on the New Jersey-New York state line in Bergen and Rockland County, running from Montvale, New Jersey to Nanuet, Nyack, New York. And that Nanuet, Nyack, New York connection is why Vronsky contacted me after I ran an episode of Crossing the Line detailing the unsolved murder of a teenager walking home from a mall in Nanuet. After a short break, I'll get into that, more about Cottingham, and how Vronsky finally met and began interviewing a serial killer he once had a chance encounter with in an elevator. Be right back. Dr. Peter Vronsky views Cottingham as a special type of serial killer, one we don't see, thank God, all that often.
Here I can speak at least as a historian of serial killers. This guy is an outlier, unlike any serial killer that I've written about or described. Nothing in his childhood biography rings of other serial killers' typical biographies. He comes from a middle-class family. The family is intact. Mom and dad have a traditional marriage. The father is vice president at MetLife Insurance in New York. He has 3 younger sisters who adore him. He has some minor juvenile issues. He's arrested when he's 10 years old, entering with another boy a house that they kind of burglarize. And then when he's 17, he's arrested for possession of fireworks. Those are his only 2 juvenile offenses.
I need to say something about this. We don't, as human beings, rape and torture and kill and cut up bodies and burn them in numbers. They claim Cottingham has, without having endured some sort of trauma. I will never be sold on that. The brain just does not work that way. There has to be some sort of abnormality in there somewhere. I'm not saying it's sexual or physical abuse, or he was bullied or beaten up all the time by peers or others. I'm not saying an uncle got funky with him, or he witnessed some sort of sexual perversion associated with violence, which would be pretty typical with a serial killer like Cottingham. But look, there has got to be something. That crime he committed when he was 10 years old is interesting to me. 10-year-olds don't necessarily break into homes. It's too young of an age for that type of crime. So there is something else driving this 10-year-old kid. I wondered about a porn or sex addiction.
Yes, he talked about visiting kind of adult bookstores and as early as the 1960s when he was just a kid, a teen. He certainly had a fascination for bondage literature, abduction literature. Interestingly enough, it wasn't visual. In the inventories of what they seized from his house, he had a lot of textual books bondage paperbacks, abduction paperbacks, but he didn't really have the visual magazine material that was, at least nothing that was confiscated from the so-called trophy room in his house.
You see, now we are getting somewhere. And it's always there if you look and dig deep enough. The foundations for the sort of psychopathy we see later is generally present. People don't wake up one day when they're 25 or 30 and say to themselves, you know what? I think I'll start abducting, raping, and mutilating women now. Play tennis in the morning, go have lunch, boom. I think I'm going to become a serial killer now. There has to be some sort of previous buildup to it, an escalation.
I have a standing joke with him. If he doesn't tell me some kind of trauma that he had in his childhood, that I was just going to make one up. I'm going to say that he was, kept like a sex slave by priests as an altar boy, right? Because he's got nothing in his story except for one thing.
Aha! There it is. I knew it. And you will too next week in part 2. Just kidding. I wouldn't do that to you all. Though it would be a great cliffhanger. I'll say that.
When he's 4 years old, he has a serious head injury.
Early head injuries and violent behavior later in life has been studied, and the results cannot be argued with. According to one study by the National Library of Medicine, TBI, traumatic brain injury, and related antisocial behavior lines up. And pardon the dry textbook quotes here, but it's important to get it right. Traumatic brain injury has been suggested as a factor that leads to aggressive behavior through sequelae such as behavioral dysregulation or impulsiveness, causing the subjects to become involved in violent and criminal behavior. There's that impulsiveness we see time and again in Cottingham's history. He acted out on his urges. He could not contain his impulse to abduct and murder. A higher level of aggression has been found in the acute period following the head trauma. This comes through in all of the research. So I'd be curious to interview everyone in Cottingham's family and have them talk about his behaviors right after that head trauma he suffered. I would bet it's there. In post-acute phases, that same study notes a significant range of psychiatric disorders occurs, especially in terms of antisocial behaviors, both violent and nonviolent. And let's just qualify antisocial behaviors here for a minute so we are all on the same page. Antisocial behavior refers to activities on the most severe end of the spectrum of socially unacceptable behavior, such as rule breaking, delinquency, nuisance behavior, vandalism, and physical and verbal aggression. I guess that break-in when he was 10 years old could be considered vandalism, nuisance behavior, rule breaking, delinquency. So you see how it all fits. Even more notably, however, infamous serial killers Richard Ramirez, Jeffrey Dahmer, John Wayne Gacy, and Ed Gein reportedly suffered head trauma as children. And most are aware of what they did later on in life, a lot of which is similar to what Cottingham did. Cottingham, though, will not allow his brain to be scanned at this time, which is kind of bizarre to me. So I asked Vronsky why.
He hates doctors. He hates hospitals. He says every time he goes into a hospital, he comes back worse. All right. So he promised me that I can have his brain when he dies. He's going to pin a note to his pillow, give Dr. Vronsky my brain, and I'll come down and pick it up in a pickle jar and get it scanned.
I want to now just take a minute and read an email Vronsky received from Cottingham in February 2022, which plays into the reason why Vronsky contacted me. Peter, I need your sleuthing ability. An old case may have come into memory, or it's just a figment of my imagination. I believe this one occurred either 1972, 3, or 4. It would have occurred within visual distance of a mall either in Suffern or Nyack, New York. She was a white girl in her teens. She may have been coming from the mall. I may be mixing her up with someone else because I see long curly hair but darker than blonde hair. I kind of remember her putting up a good fight, which surprised me, and because of that, we didn't get around to having sex. She wasn't a sex worker, although Cottingham uses the derogatory term hooker. He says he remembers it happening during the day, probably late morning. So he then implores Vronsky, see if you can find anything in the newspapers on something around that time which fits into that criteria. He just goes on to babble a little bit. And then at the end, he says this, probably nothing, just mixing up cases in my head. So this is where Peter Vronsky and I begin to butt heads a little bit. Some serial killer homework for you. I would encourage you to go back into the Crossing the Line catalog and listen to episode 67 from last year, May 23rd, 2024, called The Body Behind the Mall, Lisa Thomas, before you come back next week and listen to part 2. That is the episode Vronsky heard and reached out to tell me I was likely wrong about writing off Cottingham and Lisa Thomas's murder so quickly, which is what I did in the episode. You know, Cottingham had come forward and kind of admitted to Lisa Thomas's murder. And in the episode, I'm like, yeah, I don't think it's him. But if you don't want to go back and listen to that old episode, I get it. And we'll recap it here next week in part 2. So until then, be safe, be aware. I know I ask you this every week, but I just want to say something here. Since my Crossing the Line Presents limited series, 34 Fairview Road, has come out, we have been bad review bombed by people who don't want to face the truth in that case and to attack anyone who even questions that truth. So their leader has gone on to tell them to give the show bad reviews, 1-star reviews. And so that's what they did. I've inquired to Apple and other places about taking those reviews down because there are strict guidelines about that now, but it seems that it hasn't been done. So if you could, I'd appreciate a review of the show that reflects your opinion and your true feelings about what we're doing here. It would mean the world to me. Crossing the Line is executive produced by M. William Phelps, LLC, and Matthew Valentinus, Mom's Basement Management. Written by me, M. William Phelps. Audio mastering and mixing by Matt Russell. Music by Epidemic Sound. Original music written and performed by Thomas Mooney, Tom Phelps, and Matt Russell.